Welcome to the Gaudium et Spes podcast, where every other week we bring you Catholic teachings and stories of faith from people throughout the Diocese of Pensacola-Tallahassee. Now, here are your hosts, Suzanne McNinch and Chez Filippini.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Gaudium et Spes podcast. Thanks so much for listening. We are not in the studio today. Luke, we're on the alternate field trip. Where are we at, man?
We are in a very private location on FSU's campus that only certain people can get us access to. This is the Religion and Classics Library here in Dodd Hall, where I spent hundreds of hours studying in complete silence while I was working on my PhD. And we have a special guest who's got us access to this really beautiful location. So we have Dr. Aline Kalbian, who's a former professor in the religion department here and is now an associate dean. What's your title? Associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences? Correct. Yeah. So thank you for getting us in here. And
sure. I had to pull a lot of strings, I want you to know.
and much more for joining us for this conversation. So Chez and I have been working through a series of episodes talking about the social tradition of the Catholic Church, the different encyclicals. And so I thought, I wonder if Aline, as you've told me to call you, might be willing to record an episode with us on Populorum Progressio. So I gave you homework this time.
I know.
Luke and I have both been victims of Dr. Kalbian's classes, if I could say no. Incredibly enlightening. I was lucky enough to take 2 undergrad classes with her, one on the social encyclicals, which was my first introduction to the document we're studying. Wow. Much more, I'm assuming, many more time spent collaborating, learning with Dr. Kalbian.
She had to read my dissertation a lot of times, so
it was
we
brilliant.
We can canonize her right now,
That's awesome.
with all that reading.
Once again, welcome, Dr. Kalbian. If you could just give us a little CV, who you are, what you're doing around here.
In addition to being like a nerd who loves to read papal encyclicals, as Luke mentioned, for many years I've been a faculty member here in the Department of Religion at Florida State University, where I had the chance to work with fabulous students. About 4 years ago, I was invited by the dean to move up to his office to be an associate dean for the college. So unfortunately, I don't teach anymore because it's a pretty full-time job over there. So this opportunity has been great for me to kind of go back to the things I love. My own research focused primarily on Catholic social ethics, sexual ethics, and bioethics. And I published 2 books that have to do with Catholicism and sexuality.
Okay. And you came to the Tallahassee area in what year?
No, I came here in 1998.
Okay.
So I've been here, I keep losing track of how many years, but quite a while. So my whole career as an academic has been here in the fabulous religion department at FSU.
Awesome.
It's so cool. Luke and I, being students here, this is a podcast for the Catholic Diocese, and it is crazy to think about how many Catholic students have passed through your undergrad courses, your graduate courses, how many people you've formed. We're very used to our priests forming us, our parish faith formation leaders, but there's this cadre of professors over here who have really shaped the minds and hearts of a lot of people who are in our pews or have gone on to other things. So
I've really have loved the students I've worked with, and then it's just always, even more of an honor to continue to be friends with former students and to watch them, flourish in their own careers and do all the brilliant things you knew they were going to do. So now I get to sit back and just be a guest.
Yeah.
Where are we at? Where are we at in this series? What are we talking about?
So we're talking about Populorum Progressio, which is encyclical from Paul VI, written in 1967. It's actually the second to last encyclical letter that he would write. So he writes Progressio in 1967, then of course Humanae Vitae in 1968, and then he doesn't write any more encyclicals. He continues to publish other letters. So this is special in that sense that it's the penultimate encyclical that he wrote, and it's focused on the question of human development, which I guess was probably a somewhat hot topic at the time, maybe a newer thing to be talked about on a global scale. Like the UN and the United Nations was still a relatively new thing, getting its footing going. So it was, now if you say the Pope has comments on the concept of human development, nobody would find that strange, but it was a new territory for the church, and so Paul VI wrote a pretty brief encyclical. So it's mercifully short compared to some others that we will have to read later in this series. But there's a lot of richness to it and some very intriguing things. And I almost wish we could have had the cameras turned on when we were setting up, because Dr. Kalbian and I were just talking, first impressions, things that we remembered or didn't remember about it. So it's a fascinating text, and I think we're going to have plenty to talk about.
Yeah. Before we get into the substance of it, one of the coolest things that Dr. Kalbian shared with her students a lot of time when we'd hit this encyclical in the middle was, you met this guy. So he's not just a person you studied, but he's somebody you saw in the flesh. So tell us about that.
I did. Yeah. So this was always interesting to me. So when I was a mere child, my family had the great honor to have a private audience with Pope Paul VI at the Vatican in Rome. And so, of course, as I grew up, I mean, I didn't think much of it. I guess as I got older, I realized it was kind of unusual. Not most people wouldn't have had an audience. But then when I, really sort of started focusing my research more and more on a lot of the papal encyclicals in the 60s and 70s, and especially on sexual ethics, I spent a lot of time writing about Humanae Vitae in particular. Yeah. And so Paul VI, was suddenly very interested in him. And one day it kind of hit me. I was like, wait a minute. I met him about 6 months before he issued that encyclical.
That's right.
If I'd only known.
You could have asked him.
Asked him. And this encyclical, Populorum, appeared about 6 months before I met him. Wow. Mm-hmm. So he'd already issued this encyclical. So, and I have a photo.
Please share it? Yeah. This is why we're here.
So this is it, the photo. So this is, I don't know if you can see it, but it's is it better to hold it there?
No, you're good. That's exactly what
so that's, you can see the Pope with his back to the camera, and then my father here in the forefront, and then my mother is holding, grasping the Pope's hand, pleading with him. And then you'll see a little tiny child's face wearing a leopard skin cap. That would be me, peering out at it. And, and it was very important. I was telling these guys earlier, a very important moment for my family. My family is Palestinian, and we had just gone through the 6-Day War, and we were leaving Palestine to come to the United States. And my mom, was a very devout Catholic, wanted very much to have the opportunity to meet the Pope, to ask him to pray for our family, but also to ask him to pray for the Palestinian people and to share with her, what she had experienced and what the Christians in Palestine were experiencing. So that was the context for the event. And never would I have thought that, it would now become part of a podcast years later. So.
I mean, I vividly remember it happening in class. Like, whoa, I hadn't met the Pope at that point in time. It was maybe a rarer thing back then. Like you said, we were talking before, and Paul VI is maybe the first truly international version of a pope. People are now very used to, if you meet a fellow Catholic who's pretty involved, and they're just like, yeah, I went to some audience or something like that. Right. This is still a time when not everybody got in.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was pretty cool.
So just real quick, Luke, we're gonna get. You know me. This is the last Italian pope in the series, so I'm kind of heartbroken. So we're gonna do a little.
I hadn't thought of that.
We're turning it over to Eastern and Central Europe after this, and then Argentina, if we get to there. But it's just a little bit about Papa Montini. This is a moment of transition in your life as you met him. Mm-hmm. He's often seen. He's a saint. He's also kind of seen as he's a transitional pope. He is leading one era of the church into another in a unique way. So some biographical notes. He's born 1897 up in Brescia. He's born, this is classic Italian naming, Giovanni Battista Enrico Maria Montini. So if you think just, some of the Latin American countries give a lot of names, or Spanish, the Italians do it too. His dad, we met, our last pope was a sharecropping family. He's from the upper middle class, and his dad was a journalist, later politician, served 3 terms in the Italian Chamber of Deputies under the Italian Popular Party under Don Luigi Sturzo until it was broken apart by fascism. He got ordained in 1920. His first experience in leadership, he was the head of the ecclesial observing unit of the National Italian Federation of Catholic University Students. So he was a man who got to be acquainted with the massive transitions that were happening in the mindset of young people, especially under fascism. He was a professor at the Lateran. He got 3 degrees, another well-read pope. So what do you know? I don't think you get to be pope without being somewhat well-read. He served as the Undersecretary of State during World War II underneath Pius XII. So there's a whole 7-volume series. I'm assuming we go in on his work there, but nevertheless, he saw some things in there. He was the Archbishop of Milan, named in 1954, and then he was named Pope in 1958 by John the 23rd. He started traveling a lot then. He was... He as a cardinal, he made some appearances outside of Italy. I think he went to the Holy Land.
I think he mentions in Populorum Progressio that the trip to Palestine and one other country, I can't remember, India.
Yeah,
maybe,
I think it was India.
Yeah, that really had an effect.
He talks about Bombay. That's right. And then he was, as John the 23rd declined in health, he was seen as a favorite as the Second Vatican Council started to take over the papacy when Papa Roncalli died. And he was elected Pope in June 1963. His first parts of his pontificate are very, like, they're highlight moments. He famously met with the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople. And what was, I mean, it was pretty unheard of at the time that these men would, shake hands, meet in a place of common interest, and chart out a really some of the foundations of the modern ecumenical movement. He was the guy in charge of closing Vatican II, so no small feat. He was the guy in charge of the entire liturgical reform that happened after Vatican II, so no small feat. And then he was really, the 70s were an interesting time in Italy. It was a time of great civil strife. It was called the Years of Lead, where there were domestic terrorism incidents, a lot of social upheaval. The year 1968 you mentioned was a huge moment in European life as a lot of university students walked out of their classes and protested in the streets. A little bit of a kind of a socialist Marxist flavor in that, a time of great transition. He saw towards the end of his pontificate, one of his closest friends, Aldo Moro, he was a former prime minister of Italy. He was kidnapped in these years of lead and abducted and killed outside of Rome. Papa Montini had made a special plea to the Italian people and to the people who kidnapped him to return him, to no avail. Kind of broke his heart, and he died a couple months after this happened in August of 1978. So 70s were hard. He is well known for a couple things. Just finally, he made a cardinal out of his 3 successors. So he made a cardinal out of John Paul I, John Paul II, and Papa Ratzinger. And then he was the first pope to step foot not just on one continent besides Europe. He ended up in all the continents besides Antarctica. So when we think of, again, the papacy, he's the first one that kind of like, oh yeah, he gets on planes, he walks off planes, he meets people on the tarmac, he kisses babies. He, you see him in Yankee Stadium, I think you mentioned.
Yeah,
Luke.
he went to the old Yankee Stadium.
So yeah. So transitional figure. I'll set the stage. Luke,
sure.
Where are we going?
Yeah, well, the main question at the heart of this encyclical is, how can the church interact with this question of development? So the central thing that he's saying is, it's almost because globalism had really begun to take its, to take off, that we're more aware of the problems in the world, in other parts of the world, not just our own local problems. So he sees an urgent, desire on behalf of non-governmental organizations and other nations. People are worried about solving problems like poverty and hunger, and disease and education, and there's all of these problems that need to be solved, and he encourages that. But I think his unique contribution in this document is to say, but what does complete or full development look like? So he develops this term of transcendent humanism, okay, where he wants to say humanism, sure, but it has to have a spiritual layer on top of it, added onto it. That's the thing that really is the heart of the encyclical, and he kind of goes through different points about that, and is trying to encourage people to take action. So I don't know if you noticed this when you were reading it. It's not merely a sober analysis of the problems, and let's see what Aquinas or the Bible would say about these problems. But there is an urgency
Absolutely.
To solve some of these problems. So when I think just generally about this document, it's that question of transcendent humanism or authentic or complete development. He uses a couple of different terms. Integral human development. Yeah. That's what comes to my mind. What do you, I know you saw that, but what else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with all that you said, but actually your introduction sort of got me thinking more about that particular historical moment. And I think, if you think about the post-World War period, and then you have the Cold War really building up, and then you have, sort of the beginning of the end of colonialism. So all of a sudden you have these, countries all over the world that had been controlled by European powers. Those powers are either being ousted out or they're leaving. And so suddenly you have these nations having to figure out how to function in the modern world. And because colonialism imposed and introduced so much modern apparatus to these introduced a modern apparatus to these nations. And so I feel like the context of the moment is really urgent because there are all these things happening at that moment. And he also, it's very much addressed, a lot of encyclicals you feel are really addressed to fellow bishops and popes, fellow bishops and cardinals. In this case, there's very much a sense that he's speaking not just to Catholics, but to a much larger audience of people in non-governmental organizations, people in politics, people in government, but also to individual Catholics. And I think that's what's so masterful about it, because he's really able to adopt a tone that works for all these people.
He makes urgent pleas, certainly to nations, but he also says, individuals, you too have to do this thing. And it's almost, you can't tell sometimes where the emphasis is. Is it, if we get enough individual people to see these problems, then the nation as a whole is going to respond appropriately? Or do we need to really kind of shake our fists at world leaders to get them to take some steps, and lead their people? You mentioned the colonialism ending or falling apart, that wasn't like a decision, in one moment, but it begins to step away. And it shows for Paul VI, and you see this in other documents, but he mentions it, the widening gap between those developed nations and those undeveloped nations. The rich are getting richer and the poor are languishing, and it's a sort of an unacceptable problem in the modern era. So he says at various points, like, maybe the wealthier nations need to have a higher tax rate on themselves. So that they can...
On luxury goods in particular. Yeah.
Oh, pay more for imports.
Yes.
So he says these may be the kind of painful things that we need to do to take
there is
some
that
steps.
Passage towards the end, I don't know if you noticed it, Luke, where he specifically uses the language of sacrifice. And he's like, people have to be willing to make a sacrifice. But I think one thing that has always fascinated me about this is the concept of dividing the world into developed and non-developed nations is clearly problematic, right? Because it presumes that development, is this that underdeveloped nations are somehow not civilized in the way that developed nations are. But I think in this context, he's using it partly as an economic definition, like developed economically. But what he really seems to be at the heart of it for him is that he's really worried that if you just focus on economic development, then what's going to happen to these nations that are underdeveloped economically is that they might develop economically, but then they're going to lose a lot of their cultural integrity.
That's right.
And so I think that because clearly he's a critic of industrialized Western society in here, because he sees what excessive wealth can do to people, and he worries about that. Nevertheless, he wants to encourage the world to come together and help these countries build wealth.
He talks about the anonymous university student who comes from an underdeveloped nation, goes to the rich nation. He's like, this is great. They received a great education. He forgot his entire identity. He doesn't remember who he is. He's consumed by consumerism and all these kind of vices that were never part of his cultural heritage. He's like, this is not the way to go. Can I ask real quick, Dr. Kalbian, would this be a time, the term the third world, is this a well-known concept at this point in time?
I think that develops more into the 70s and 80s. This and then now, of course, people kind of shy away from that terminology too. Of there's now, I think you hear people talk more about the North and the global North and the global South.
Okay. Yeah.
But those kind of dichotomies in the way he divides the world into developed and developing, and then hungry versus those blessed with abundance, which I thought was really interesting. And then traditional culture versus modern industrialization.
Yeah.
And he wants to retain traditional culture. It's not that modern industrialization is the answer, but he understands that economic growth has to be tied to modern industrialization. Like, these countries aren't going to be able to achieve the kind of economic security that they need to get out of the cycle of poverty that they have. But then the problem is, how do you do that without falling into the dangers that modern industrialization pose, especially to the soul of the individual?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because then it becomes all about the money.
Yeah, it's fascinating that he wants to find some sort of way to fuse these two things together, right? He's not trying to say to the developed nations or the wealthy countries or whatever term he wants to use. He doesn't want to say to them, you shouldn't have any of those things. Like, get rid of it.
Right.
Go take steps backwards. But he's very concerned about what you said, like the soul of, or the wisdom of these ancient nations, or undeveloped nations, this ancient wisdom that they have, that needs to be kept as a noble human good and not lost in the process of trying to bring them along through education or political development or economic development. So he says in paragraph 40, it should also be pointed out that many nations poorer in economic goods are quite rich in wisdom and can offer noteworthy advantages to others. So he sees this sort of complementarity between the different kinds of nations, and he's trying to figure out how to keep the best of both worlds, which is a beautiful goal, but it's obviously very difficult in practice.
Right.
It's like, when people, immigrate from another country, do they maintain their language or not? My father was born in Mexico, grew up speaking obviously Spanish, and he moved to the U.S., and he didn't teach me Spanish as a kid growing up, He'd had no problem speaking English and Spanish, but he wasn't trying actively to preserve the Spanish, which is a common first-generation immigrant thing. So you can kind of see that in play here. He goes on to say in that paragraph, the next sentence, every country, rich or poor, has a cultural tradition handed down from past generations, and this tradition includes institutions required by life in the world and higher manifestations, artistic, intellectual, and religious, of the life of the spirit. So what you see in every part is he wants to show a way for there to be concern for these more than merely economic or prudential problems, but to keep maintain an emphasis on some sort of spiritual yearning.
We've read these encyclicals so far. The assumption is, I think there's a presumption in the other authors we've talked about, that the audience is primarily Catholic, maybe the broader audience. They know what the church's vision of man is. But he takes some time to outline this, maybe called transcendental humanism, this spiritual longing. He talks about man's supernatural destiny. Dr. Kalbian, could you take us through what's his vision of a person that he's trying to communicate to the world?
Yeah. It's clear. On one level, it's clear, right, that there is a way that the human person, using his or her reason, without faith in God or without, supernatural assistance, would be able to solve some of these problems. So he acknowledges that these are practical problems, how to make sure that the poorest people in the world actually have the resources they need to survive. And so he acknowledges that, but what he worries about is that then people might think, well, that's the beginning and end of the problem right there. It's like we bring everybody up and then everybody has food and then we're good to go. But that's not at all what he thinks. So he thinks that what really the ultimate goal isn't just the development of peoples or development of society, but the development of the individual human. And it's a teleological development. So he believes that each of us needs to develop to to become the persons we're intended to be. And that, the ultimate goal of the human is the supernatural, the transcendent, the communion, the friendship with God. And so I think that and then, if you try to get practical with him, as I was doing when I was reading it, it's like, well, how would it really look different, like in a practical way, for the faithful person versus the non-faithful person to be truly human, right? And I think what he seems to be saying is that the lure of greed, the lure of money, the lure of the things of this world are so powerful and strong that, as hard as you try, you're not going to be able to resist them without that supernatural dimension. At least that's how I took it.
And he has a note in here about developed nations should take on some sort of sacrifice, some sort of, maybe a higher tax rate or whatever. But he has this interesting note that if you don't take some strong steps to address the real problems in the world that you have resources to solve, if you don't do something about it, God may cast punishment upon you that you won't be that will be worse for you. So it's this weird way. It's like, even if you're just being selfish, do some good for other people so that maybe you won't suffer as much on your own. I thought that was one of the funniest or most interesting comments. But yeah, he develops particularly this idea that for our development to be authentic, it has to be fully human, and this means not only seeking political good, not only seeking economic good or education or culture, also the orientation toward God, toward worship, and that this is where he wants to sort of make a different argument. To what's the difference between the church and the UN? We're not trying to say the UN's useless and don't worry about all that money stuff. So we talked earlier. You might think a pope would say, well, these poor people just need to pray. If they pray, and then everything will be good. But that's not his answer at all.
No.
Which maybe it shouldn't be surprising, but I think a lot of people would be surprised that his answer to poverty isn't just like, well, blessed are the poor in spirit. So what do you need to worry about?
Not at all. And I think they'd be, the thing about being taxing the wealthy, and the thing about, that individuals might have to sacrifice. I mean, he's really asking these wealthy nations. I mean, he comes up with that, I can't think of the term, the World Council concept where all nations, pitch in money.
Yeah.
And I mean, he really feels that that every nation has a duty to lift up all the other nations.
Yeah.
But you're right. I mean, he believes in an economic solution. I mean, there's no doubt about that. It's not just a spiritual solution. But what makes it an integrated development is that he's saying that he's looking around probably and seeing the UN and these other agencies and organizations who are arguing for a purely economic and political solution. And he's saying, well, yeah, we need the economic and political solution. But if we did just that and didn't attend to the fact that this is also about individual humans flourishing and being, their most sort of excellent selves, then the political and the economic development will be meaningless. And to be honest, if you look at the world around us, right, a lot of countries that were struggling have increased in wealth. And has it really brought them greater happiness? Has it brought them greater peace? I mean, I think that's sort of what he's getting at, is that, you can find ways to make countries richer, but that's the church's role. And I think this is an important piece of it when he talks about reading the signs of the times and what is it that the church can bring. I feel like he's saying the church has this ability to kind of look at a problem and be able to interpret it in a much deeper kind of way. Like to say,
it's very important you brought that up. This is, I think, the first pope we've read where he said very much what we claim now is the church's expertise. The church is an expert in man, we rightly, he says, paraphrasing, we rightly recognize the separation between church and state, the two swords. We maintain a perspective that is essentially unavailable to individual nation states. We've talked a lot about, when we talked about Pius XI, he was the first person to emerge out of the prisoner of the Vatican era, essentially, to sign the Lateran Accords, and there's like a little bit of free movement there. But this long-standing, embittered, the church will not relinquish her rights. The Pope will not relinquish his rights to be the head of a sovereign state. This is kind of a moment where you're like, I get where we're at now. I kind of see the writing on the wall. We have an elevated responsibility, which is to guide the world in these senses that maybe when they're in their, invested in their own foreign policy, economic policy, they can't see the forest for the trees. So that caught my eye. I was like, none of the other popes have talked like that so far. I was like, we're kind of above the mix. I shouldn't say they haven't, but this is in a different way. I want to just real quickly, it is towards the end, just to wrap up maybe the economic feature here. He talks about things that are anathema to the free market system that he says, I don't care if it's anathema to your free market system. He says free trade as exercised now is not sufficient. Mm-hmm. Contracts between, we heard laborers.
Yeah, more powerful and weaker nations.
But he's like, the same things that Leo was talking about.
Yes.
An industrialist and an individual. They agreed on something. You can't make any judgment. He says that's not sufficient. He says the same thing between these powerful nations, these smaller nations.
That is right. Yeah, so there needs to be real beneficence on the part of the more powerful nations. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they can't make any money, but it means things like, not just coming in and as quickly as possible getting everything valuable that country has to offer and then ditching them. Mm-hmm. Setting up training for those people to sustain themselves when this project or this operation is finished. And, it's sort of the classic thing that even in America, companies will promise that, if you, hey, whatever county, give us a deal on this land because we're going to bring 2,000 jobs and we're going to train people and they're going to be, even in America within its own self, you can see that sort of, that's what we're promising to do. And then we come in and like, they kind of don't follow through on that. So you see Paul VI kind of saying not to do that, don't abuse these countries, don't abuse their people, but use these as opportunities to transform them while you're benefiting yourself. That's okay. I don't know how easy it is to or how hard that would be to actually do,
Well, one of the contexts I was thinking about, and I didn't have time to sort of do my homework, sorry, Professor, on this piece, but I'm imagining that like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were probably being developed at around the same time period. Because those are the kind of models that, both of those organizations are problematic in a number of ways, but that whole notion of, finding ways to invest in countries and help them build themselves and stuff would have been something that he would have been thinking about. And I also think that this was probably the period when Catholic charitable organizations were also growing rapidly. Because I think that there's a shift with a lot of religious Christian communities in particular in the 50s and 60s from the kind of the missionary model where you're just going in simply to convert to this sort of more charitable model where you're going in and, you might be converting people along the way, but you're also there. And he talks about it like building infrastructure, hospitals, schools, that interesting paragraph about the missionary presence where he acknowledges that, there were errors made. However, he wants to acknowledge that there were some positive outcomes. So he kind of papers over that period.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Yeah, he mentions Caritas International, which in the United States we're familiar with Catholic Charities. Right. Most of the world is familiar with Caritas, which is this very, very, very large multinational church ministry, essentially that just does exactly the same. Evangelization, maybe we could say second, development first in a lot of ways, but this is all new in many ways. Dr. Kalbian, you, as you mentioned in your introduction, you know Humanae Vitae, the Catholic sexual ethic debate. This is 1 year before. I hear lots of premonitions of Humanae Vitae in this document when he talks about family, when he talks about the population conversation. Talk us through that part of this document.
So obviously by 1967, when Populorum is issued, the world, Catholics in particular, are sort of on the edge of their seats wondering what's going to happen on the issue of contraception. Because as you may recall, in Gaudium et Spes, I believe it was, one of the Vatican II documents, there was sort of an intimation that the church was going to kind of look at this more carefully. And then there was this commission that was set up. And so there was talk that there was going to be some kind of document coming out. So I'm sure when Populorum was issued, and there was a section on the family, everybody would be flipping to get to that page. I would have been to see what he had to say. And so he doesn't really address contraception directly, but he addresses the population problem, or the perceived population, dilemma at the time. And then he encourages families to be responsible in their decisions about raising families. And then, repeats stuff, that can go all the way back to your favorite Pope Leo the 13th about the family precedes the state and the importance of the state not interfering with the family. Two other things that might not be so obvious that I'll mention is that I think that one of the things that's interesting in Humanae Vitae and that a lot of people grapple with is that there seems to be some kind of divide between the way he's perceiving something that you might think of as natural family control or natural reproductive control, and then artificial means. And so this distinction between natural and artificial, which he mentions in Humanae Vitae, he also talks about technology in Humanae Vitae. Yeah. So I thought that there was, here he's concerned a bit about technology, and so I wondered if that, it would be interesting to reread Humanae Vitae in light of that. And then the final thing is that in most of Humanae Vitae is making a case against the use of certain contraceptive means as, based on a sort of intrinsic belief in what the Marriage Act is about and what the Marriage Act is about and what procreation means. But at the very end of Humanae Vitae, he lays out a bunch of negative consequences that will happen if people use artificial contraception. So, from a philosophical point of view, he's kind of drawing on kind of consequentialist arguments. He's not saying that's the only reason this is wrong, but he's saying, oh, and by the way, this is going to have all these negative repercussions. I see that in this document, too, that there is in his idea of integral human development, it's about a sort of belief in the intrinsic truth of what the human is. Yeah. But then he is bringing up kind of consequentialist types of arguments. Like, if we don't pay attention to this, these are the consequences. So.
Yeah, I think these are twin documents that are best read together. And we know that by 67, when he's writing this document, he's already received the minority and majority reports from that papal commission on contraception that had been launched under John the 23rd, and then Paul VI expanded it significantly, greatly increased the numbers of clergy and even and put laity on it that weren't previously on that commission. It was a if you want to do a Humanae Vitae episode, Chez, we're gonna have to do like three-part series on it.
Budget it in there.
They go together very well because I think what you can see in both of them is an attempt for instance, in Progressio to look at political and economic and social issues and see the scientific or the technological dimension of it. What's good about it? What good can we harness from these modern developments? But where's the genius of the human person that we don't want to override, that we don't want to lose, that we don't want to throw away? The way that I think about the relationship between Progressio and Humanae Vitae is that, Progressio is sort of thinking like global in scale. What's the role for technology versus traditional wisdom? Where do those intersect and what's that balance? And in Humanae Vitae, it's like a zoomed in discussion on one particular question, one particular application of technology versus, the ancient moral law. And in Humanae Vitae, like the language that he uses for discerning, how to space the children, how many children to have, whether to have only a few or to make a decision, out of an abundance of charity to have a large family and to have great faith in God and to do that. You're making a judgment that is not just, he says it's really interesting, this judgment cannot just be based around economic, political, social, educational questions, but about the ultimate end of man, which he brings up here. So yeah, I think these are certainly, they had to have been documents that he was kind of working on at the same time, but publishes maybe one before the other. And there's a way that you can read Progressio as sort of laying the general foundation for the arguments that he's going to make in Humanae Vitae. I hadn't thought about the technological, sort of like the negative consequences here in Progressio, which, in Humanae Vitae 17 is where there's that outline that, men will take advantage of women. There will be a general lowering of moral standards. That's the first consequence. And then, governments will be involved, will overstep their bounds if this sorts of thing, happens. So there's a lot there, certainly, between these two documents.
It's part of his biography that I mentioned. He sees this in his lifetime. At this time, by the way, divorce is still illegal in Italy.
In Italy, yeah.
1970, it's liberalized by the parliament, and then it goes to a referendum in 1974, which was very much seen as an acid test for, does the church have authority in the lived experience of Catholics? And they lost. So it was resounding. It was 60% of the population affirmed in 1974, yes, we want divorce. And then in 1978, in the last year's pontificate, abortion was legalized for the first time in Italy, up to 12 weeks. And these consequences happened in his lifetime. And it was such a transition for him. He was part of the post-war era that was part of the apparatus of Pius XII that was telling Italian voters, like, under pain of mortal sin, you cannot vote for a communist government. You have to vote for the Christian Democrats. And they listened. And 25 years later, they don't listen anymore. And like just this tide had just shifted under his feet so quickly. And we know the aftermath of, maybe we'll put a bow on Humanae Vitae. The aftermath of Humanae Vitae was not sunshine and rainbows, harmony, and sing-songiness. No,
it was not. I mean, that's the thing. And I mean, it reverberates today still. I mean, as does this document. That was one of the things that Luke and I were talking about before. Luke had, in some notes he'd sent me, he thought that it strikes him that this could literally have been written today. And I said, well, I totally disagreed. I didn't think it could be written today because there was this kind of innocence to this document. And, naive, almost a naivete, like, yes, we can fix this. And yes, I feel like so much today, for example, we've seen even, when he was talking about excessive wealth in 1967, I mean, he couldn't have imagined the kind of excessive wealth that, we see in our societies. And I mean, even, let's not talk about different countries, but even within our own country, like the divergence of status. And, I feel like, you sort of read it and you're like, yeah, this sounds really good, but it just doesn't feel realistic. I mean, unless if you read it more for the kind of spiritual, theological content, and I think that truth, transcends, right? It still holds. But the bit about, countries can just band together and we'll like infuse money into the poor countries, and then everything will be good. Everybody will read, they'll have food, everything will be good. And, I just feel like, now if he were to address that problem today, I mean, where do you even begin? How do you even begin to frame it?
I guess it's interesting that in the social tradition, in the beginning and even still by, Paul VI in the 60s, there's something new about the Pope trying to encourage solutions, right? It's like, oh, he's interested now. Yeah. That's all right. But maybe today, what might be new is, who knows what Leo XIV's first encyclical is going to be, or when he'll contribute to the social tradition. But maybe now the what's changing is there's an awareness that just a moral exhortation from the Pope is probably not going to, we're not even hopeful that if he writes that letter and he gets it just right, we're going to find the solution, and you can sort of still see that here in 67 that, hey, this is what we got to do. Let's get on board.
See, I thought you were going to go in a different direction there at the end, because I think, given the kind of moral authority that I think a lot of the popes in the last few decades have had, even outside of Catholic circles, I think people do turn their head and say, that there is some kind of moral wisdom, maybe not like practical economic solutions is what you'd expect them to give. But I'm thinking, for example, Francis's writing on the environment. I feel like that really did have an impact that resonated and really brought that issue to the forefront in a way that that was really significant. So I do think that in some ways that's a more powerful role than, to sort of do what he's doing here, which is to try to come up with solutions to economic and social problems.
Right. Yeah, I think the moral authority is still certainly there. It's like the exhortation has to be in that arena more than in like, what can we get the UN to do? I mean, the UN was still pretty new at this time. Well, you mentioned the environmental question earlier. We were talking about. It's interesting that in discussing the wide range of critical problems facing the world, Paul VI just goes, just right over environmental questions. There's an urge to, be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. Let's take advantage of the earth's natural goods, and that's going to be an important part.
Right.
So that's an interesting development from then till now.
Even there's that one passage where when he's talking about how these underdeveloped nations can advance. And he mentions, taking advantage of their natural resources, utilizing their natural resources. And there isn't the awareness at that moment. Although by the, mid-60s, I think the environmental movement is definitely around and people are thinking about it. But he's thinking, more in terms of, again, I think for him, the economic solution it's very practical. So you look at these nations and you think, how can they lift themselves up out of economic poverty? And, using the natural resources that they have would be an obvious solution.
Yeah.
But, not thinking about the ways that can be abused and taken advantage of. And it is interesting. The two other things that were missing that made it not feel like a contemporary document were that, when he talks about hospitality to the stranger, which is a topic that is very interesting to me and I think is so powerful at this particular moment.
Sure.
But he's not really talking about immigrants and the migration of people, only sort of incidentally worried about students coming from other countries to study in the developed nations and that they might lose touch with their indigenous ways and all of that. But I think that if you look at the world today, I mean, the call to hospitality is just so, the demand is so strong and urgent in a way that I think he might not have been able to imagine,
Can I ask, as a person who was literally experiencing this firsthand, in 1967, was it sort of still a time when it was like, it goes without saying that people will welcome you as a stranger, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've thought about that a lot because as I said earlier, my family immigrated to this country when I was about 9 years old and, to a small town in Virginia. And my family was welcomed. I mean, we never felt, at least, I mean, I was young, but even my parents never felt ostracized. But, I always think they had so many advantages. My father was a medical doctor, so they had education. They spoke fluent English. They were, lighter skinned and they were Christian, so in a lot of ways they could blend in a way that, if they had been darker skinned Muslims who didn't know English and weren't educated, would have been a different thing. But there wasn't that kind of, if anything, my memory of my childhood is that, people treating us like we were exotic and interesting and like, oh, cool,
Yeah.
And rather than with fear or that we're here to take their jobs or anything like that. And so I think, so many of us who are either first or second or third generation immigrants, knowing what our families went through, it's so painful to see now that, that's not the situation in our society where immigrants are treated so differently and with suspicion.
Yeah.
So.
That's right. One of the other things that we talked about earlier is his view of work. It's a question of work, and Chez and I have already traced this out on some of the other episodes. So everybody playing the at-home game that's watched all the episodes, you'll recognize the echoes of this conversation. But the church's social documents, beginning in Leo, when they talk about work, they have this very agrarian concept of work. Well, now there's an industrialization context for it, but you see Leo the 13th, his imagination is tolerate that as long as you can, save your money, be thrifty, the employer should give you a better wage, and you save that money, and then you go buy some land, and you'll be all taken care of. Things go back to normal. You can take care of yourself because you'll have the land. And you don't see quite that basic level. Although John the 23rd still talked quite a bit. Remember, Mater Magisters, a lot about agriculture.
He does.
Farming.
He's got a whole section.
I just wanted, but I noticed
the sharecropping background. I remember.
I noticed when you're talking about kind of that environmental awareness, he talks about, smaller nations, underdeveloped nations are disadvantaged by this cash crop single export model, but he doesn't talk about individual farmers like the previous popes did. He talks about he treats these like, well, and you think a place like Jamaica with a sugar crop forever, or I don't know, Eastern Ukraine with a wheat crop or something like that. That he's thinking he's kind of moved out of that.
So it's like agribusiness rather than
he's already like, I can't talk about 40 acres and a cow anymore.
Right.
It's like anyhow, but this is important. But talk more about the work, the assessment that he has.
Yeah, well, it's just that his concept. So what we were saying earlier, what we were discussing prior to getting the recording started, is that the principles, can still apply. The function of work, its value, the dignity therein, but trying to draw out practical recommendations from some of these older documents around a question like work is really hard. I mean, and I think this is the expectation everybody has for Leo the 14th's first encyclical is everybody thinks it's going to be about artificial intelligence and it's going to have to say something about the relationship between AI and work.
Right.
And you're not teaching now, but I imagine if you were teaching full time, you'd be thinking a lot about AI.
Well,
probably as a dean, you have to get involved, right?
Yeah, we are very involved in thinking about AI. But both to, on the one hand, keeping up with training our students to know how to use AI, but at the same time, being aware of all the ways that AI could be used that aren't good. But I do think that the nature of work, in addition to AI, the other thing I was thinking of, I'm sort of struck by the statistics that show how many people in our society now do service work. And I feel like the kind of work that he's often talking about, like the craftsman or the maker or the creator, those of us who have those kinds of jobs are fortunate where we're using our minds to do things. But there's just so much labor in our society that is caring labor, right? That is really important. And I just think, I would love to see that addressed, like what that means and how that changes the nature of labor. Because to me, if you're going to talk about charity and love of neighbor as like central to integral development, that would be a really nice starting point for thinking about work, those kinds of jobs. And every time I have to go to the doctor's office or, and anytime someone is taking care of you, I'm always very aware of how that kind of work is really distinctive and important and undervalued.
He might have prudently refrained from addressing the shit. We marked in John the 23rd. John the 23rd essentially, he pokes fun at people who have white-collar jobs that he views as basically useless. And he's like, why do they get more money than the blue-collar folks who work hard in the fields? And you can already kind of tell Paul is like, no, the sands are shifting so quickly. Exactly, he's hitting him in this would be a time when maybe it's not massive migration movements, but maybe the first times where nations are seeing large, small scale, I can think of Italy, especially Eastern Europeans coming in at some points and becoming part of the service economy.
I agree. I think that's starting to happen. The other piece that we haven't talked about, I just was reminded of it, is the paragraph on racism.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
Which is, is that the first time that appears in a papal encyclical?
First time we've talked about it.
It's got to be one of the earliest times, if it's not the first.
Maybe the Vatican documents may have had something.
I think it's in Gaudium et Spes.
I don't recall it in Gaudium et Spes.
But anyway, it's a
Ghost
very,
Gaudium et Spes is
very...
150 pages, so it's certainly possible it's in there.
I thought that was, I had kind of forgotten that when I got to it. Wow.
Yeah. Well,
very
let's read this section a little bit. So he's talking about nationalism, right? And again, it's this balance. He wants countries to be proud of their heritage, but in the context of welcoming people who are not from there, there's a limit to how much you should rejoice in the good of your nation. It doesn't mean that you have to cancel out somebody else's national pride or heritage. So he says there are other obstacles in paragraph 62. There are other obstacles to the creation of a more just social order and to the development of world solidarity. Nationalism and racism. It is quite natural that nations recently arrived at political independence should be quite jealous of their newfound but fragile unity and make every effort to preserve it. It is also quite natural for nations with long-standing cultural tradition to be proud of their traditional heritage, but this commendable attitude should be further ennobled by love, a love for the whole family of man. Haughty pride in one's own nation disunites nations and poses obstacles to their true welfare. So I think a little bit about learning from Sumner Twiss, about the responsibility to protect, and this idea of sort of like defending yourself. He's saying here, the concept of sovereignty, right? Like sovereignty took on in international law such a hard, rigid edge that like we are one place and we're not the other, and these. He's like, well, let's be proud of our heritage, but we're united in some way.
Right.
So yeah, and he goes on to say racism is not the exclusive attribute of young nations, where sometimes it hides beneath the rivalries of clans and political parties with heavy losses. But during the colonial period, it often flared up between the colonists and the indigenous population. And that's just still a very raw thing in 1967.
Right, very much so.
Yeah. It hasn't gone away either.
Right. Yeah, that's the thing about sovereignty is interesting because it does, I mean, if you think of the idea of borders becoming, even more significant. So the borders between nations, which that sort of exacerbates the issue of migration, right? Because then it's like moving around. But I think that, he's sort of this business of there's a global feel to the whole thing. Like he believes that we can do something globally as a people. And maybe that's where the naivete lies for me, because of course that would be lovely. But I mean, historically, it's just so hard to imagine what that looks like, right?
Yeah.
What does it look like to do something global? And, he wants to say that, we can come together and fix some of these economic disparities. We can come together and adjust like trade arrangements and different things that, might disadvantage certain people. But I think, to go back to his fundamental theme, it's like, even though it's about people, the title is about people, like
on the
but it really is about persons, about individuals.
Yeah.
And because it really is ultimately people as a whole can't transcend their humanity. Do you know what I mean? It has to be individual.
Yeah.
That transcendence, and he there's a certain point where he sort of seems to emphasize the individual's autonomy. He says this was the part about personal responsibility, Luke, that you identified. I can't remember what page it was on, where he's talking about personal responsibility.
Paragraph 15, I think.
Yeah,
so
and
I'm gonna pull that up.
When I read that, I thought this just sounded a little different than what I would expect in a lot of earlier Catholic documents, right? Where he's saying every man is born to seek self-fulfillment, for every human life is called to some task by God. Endowed with intellect and free will, each man is responsible for his self-fulfillment, even as he is for his salvation. He is helped and sometimes hindered by his teachers and those around him. Yet whatever the outside influence exerted on him, he is the chief architect of his own success or failure. I mean, that is the autonomous man, the sort of, the modern notion of what it is to be an individual. And I've always thought of the Catholic view to not pose such a sharp dichotomy between the individual and the communal. And in that paragraph, it feels stark to me. I don't know.
Yeah,
Did you have that impression?
Yes, it's this is why this document is so fascinating, because he's trying to do two distinct things at the same time that are really hard to blend together. You know, he's trying to call the developed nations to be more generous, and for the undeveloped nations to, you know, be willing to come along, but don't lose everything,
Right.
you know. And then he emphasizes the global nature of you know, solving these sorts of problems, while at the same time, you know, raising this individual the importance of individual responsibility. I think this is such a great document, and it's not that long either. If you know, people want to read this, the shortest one we've done. So, you know,
And
it's
be
very readable. It's written in really good prose.
Yeah.
It's very easy to read. So
Would this maybe I can make a point here, Dr. Kat? Were you saying this would have been the encyclical more adequately named, like Personarum Progressio, the development of persons instead of the development of peoples?
Like, one of the things when I read encyclicals, and honestly, I've been kind of removed from this activity of thinking like a scholar. So thank you so much for bringing me back to it. And it was so much fun reading it. But I really think it's important to just really parse out each word and think about what it means. And so the idea of talking about the world in terms of peoples is really interesting, right? You know, we tend to think of countries or nations,
right,
or
states, or whatever.
communities, or traditions or something. And so, I mean, I don't know what to make of it, but I did think that passage in particular on self-development, which it leads into the section on man's supernatural destiny. So ultimately, this being the architect of your own success or failure is that your spiritual journey, you know, is sort of individual. He's saying, I mean, he's not saying that, you know, you don't need other people, but I mean, there are these two trajectories, right? That the world is going to be developing. You know, this is the trajectory, the development trajectory, which I guess means, you know, more equity, more justice. I mean, that would be the best way to phrase it. But then what's really important is that humans are developing too, right? And I think the danger is that if you have economic development, what happens to people is they start to go in the other direction.
Yeah.
And we all see it. Like, I mean, I'll be honest, like, as you grow up and, you know, the more resources you have and the less insecure economically you might feel, it's so easy to become complacent, right? And to sort of take it for granted, and to, you know, just not, and then to start wanting even things that you don't need. And, I mean, all of that. I mean, I want to, of course, do a like self-help session here for shoppers. But yeah, I mean, that idea of, you know, he's so aware that by the church pushing for economic growth and progress, that's not a green light for individual Catholics to just sort of buy into the whole, you know, competitive dog-eat-dog world of, you know, finance or whatever.
Right. Yeah. Let me just, because we haven't read this specific paragraph, I want to make sure before we get done. I know we're getting close on time.
Is it 42?
Yeah. I wanted to read this paragraph. So it says this is what I think is the center of the document. This about transcendent humanism. It says the ultimate goal is, in this translation, it says full-bodied humanism, but whatever translation you read will have some interesting term there in front of humanism, okay? So here's the ultimate goal is a full-bodied humanism. And does this not mean the fulfillment of the whole man and of every man? A narrow humanism closed in on itself and not open to the values of the Spirit and to God, who is their source, could achieve apparent success. For man can set about, this is what you were saying earlier, man can set about organizing terrestrial realities without God, but closed off from God, they will end up being directed against man. A humanism closed off from other realities becomes inhuman. True humanism points the way toward God and acknowledges the task to which we are all called, the task which offers us the real meaning of human life. Man is not the ultimate measure of man. Man becomes truly human only by passing beyond himself. In the words of Pascal, man infinitely surpasses man. I mean, that's really if you only read one paragraph, that would be the one to read.
This one strike me, it sounds like the Prima Secunda. It sounds like Thomas, like building Catholic moral ethics from, man's soul destiny is in a supernatural end.
That's right.
That is pretty much Aquinas is snuck in here. Leo the 13th would be happy. Dr. Yap, maybe as closing thoughts, as you present, over the years, you presented this to undergrads in the continuum of Catholic social teaching. Is this one you're like, it's good to know about, but maybe there's bigger fish to fry, or something like, no, this is a linchpin in the history of the church's teaching?
I don't know. I mean, I had favorites. I loved Mater et Magistra, and I loved Laborem Exercens by John Paul II on work, which I think you guys should podcast.
We will. We'll get there. We're just going in order. So
okay.
We'll hit it.
But I do. So I don't know. I mean, I think I did really emphasize this as being a document that, after the close of Vatican II, after all that was sort of promised in Vatican II, now we get to see what this might look like. And, what does it really look like to read the signs of the times? Because I think this is what he's trying to do here. Right. And so in that sense, I think it is a really important document. And I will recommend, I was telling Luke that I looked ahead at one of Benedict's encyclicals, Caritatis in Veritate, where he has quite a few paragraphs discussing Populorum Progressio. And it's really fascinating to read his take many years later of, in some ways, how important it was, but also, I mean, he doesn't, he's not going to totally diss the earlier Pope, but he's going to say that, this emphasis on economic growth may have kind of missed the whole picture or something like that. And so I do think it ends up being a really important document.
Luke, your take?
I mean, there's not much more to say. I think that's just really perfect. Now, this is a unique document in a lot of ways, and that context of following up the council. I mean, this is the first steps toward okay. Think of it this way. We're 60 years from the council, right? We're still talking about how do we receive that council? How do we apply it? How do we interpret it? He's the first person that has to move on from the council itself and take a step forward, and this is his first step. So I think just in that way, it's incredibly
historically
valuable.
significant.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think of the phrase that John the 23rd had at the outset of the council that maybe, I don't think it was an official document. Maybe it was off the cuff, where he talked about the prophets of doom.
That's an opening address.
And it's kind of like, we dare not, go out in uncharted waters. It's funny because, this is the inheritor of John the 23rd's legacy to the Vatican Council. I feel like where he's strongest is in being a prophet of doom. Like, to be frank, like you talk about AI. I think there are so many things where, just like Humanae Vitae, you're like, you should have listened. And this is like the lack of cooperation between nations, the unbridled financier attitude that pervades human hearts and whole nations versus the weaker nations. This profound lip service, and I think even at this time there was a lip service only to this cooperation, and now we see in our midst like a true disintegration. Yeah, in terms of like we're entering a new era. It's not about cooperation, and every one of us, I think, feels, whether you're scared or like whatever, I don't really care. No one's feeling like great about it. No one's like, all right, I'm excited about where this is going to lead. As wars pop up.
And I think the other thing, you think of that emphasis on sacrifice, and I think in today's context, that just seems like such an old-fashioned idea. It's like, why should I have to give up anything that I've worked so hard to get? Or and that's that optimism and that innocence, the sort of feeling that it can all somehow be fixed in that moment. And I think now it has just sort of devolved in directions he couldn't have imagined.
Indeed. Well, we'll leave it there. This was cool. This was a treat. We only got one Paul VI. He does have, if you want to, for homework, read Octogesima Adveniens. forgive my Latin pronunciation there. But we're going to pick this back up with the ultimate personalist, John Paul II, and we will be looking at this detail that will keep us busy. This a man who is fortunate to have a transitional figure like Papa Montini beforehand to get into a space where he can really dive in. The dust has settled a little bit after the council. The 70s are over, and we can have a new, fresh take on things. So thanks for following along with us, and we'll see you back here.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Gaudium et Spes podcast. If you would like to know more about our podcast, please visit our website, gaudiumetspes.net, or go to ptdiocese.org and click the button that says podcast. If you listen to the audio version from an app such as Apple Podcast, Spotify, or iHeartRadio, be sure to rate, review, and comment. If you watched us on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe or leave us a comment there as well. Thank you for joining us.